The wind was a cruel, unseen hand, stripping the land bare, leaving only the skeletal remains of winter. Alara pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, its meager warmth a mockery against the biting chill that seeped into her bones. Her breath plumed in the air, a visible testament to the cold that permeated their makeshift shelter. A derelict lean-to tucked behind the skeletal remains of an old stable, miles from the nearest town. Days bled into weeks, each one a relentless fight against the creeping tendrils of hunger and despair. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 3 months now, swallowed by the river's cruel currents, leaving her with 3 children and nothing but the bitter taste of ash and the ghost of his promises. The children, frail and quiet, huddled together, their small forms barely visible beneath a pile of scavenged blankets. Finn, the eldest at 7, tried to be brave, his eyes too old for his face. Clara, 5, clutched a wooden doll, her silent tears a constant ache in Alara's chest. Little Maeve, barely 2, whimpered occasionally, a sound that tore at Alara's very soul. They were fading, she knew. Their hunger was a gnawing beast, growing louder each day. Every waking moment was a frantic calculation. How to find food, how to keep the cold at bay, how to ward off the crushing weight of her failure. Pride, a luxury she could no longer afford, had been shed like a useless skin. Then, the rumors had reached her, whispered by a passing peddler too kind to ignore her plight. Sheriff Kane, the solitary, formidable man who owned the vast cattle ranch several miles north, needed someone to clean his barn. Not just any barn, but the sprawling, timbered structure rumored to be as grand as a church, though neglected for years. The sheriff was a man of immense wealth, an enigma shrouded in solitude, his presence alone enough to silence a room. He rarely ventured into town, preferring the isolation of his sprawling domain. The notion of approaching him, of admitting her utter destitution, twisted her stomach into knots. But the thought of her children's hollow eyes propelled her forward, a silent scream of desperation overriding all fear. It had taken 2 days to walk there, pushing the children in an old, creaking wheelbarrow, hiding them in thickets when she saw anyone approaching. When she finally stood before the imposing stone house, her reflection in its dark windows showed a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman, barely recognizable. She had knocked, a tentative tap that felt like an earth-shattering clamor in the vast silence. The man who opened the door was as unyielding as the landscape around him. Sheriff Kane, tall, broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of hard lines, framed by iron-gray hair. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept over her, missing nothing, judging everything. There was no warmth, no flicker of curiosity, only an unsettling stillness. "You're the woman who inquired about the barn?" His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. He did not invite her in, did not soften his gaze. Alara swallowed, her throat dry as dust. "Yes, Sheriff. Alara Vance. I heard you were in need of help." She fought to keep her voice steady, to project an air of competence she did not possess. He considered her, his gaze lingering on her worn clothes, her chapped hands, the faint tremor that ran through her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare before his silent scrutiny. She imagined he could smell the desperation on her, the faint scent of fear and hunger that clung to her like a shroud. "The barn has not been touched in years," he stated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's a considerable task. Filth and neglect. The pay will be fair, but the work, it will be hard. Are you capable?" Alara met his gaze, drawing on a reserve of defiance she didn't know she possessed. "I am capable, Sheriff. I am more than capable." Her voice, though thin, held a surprising edge of conviction. For her children, she would move mountains. She would clean this man's barn until her hands bled, if only it meant they would not starve. The very air around him seemed to crackle with unspoken power, a stark contrast to her own utter powerlessness. This job was not just work. It was survival. The barn was indeed a monument to neglect. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight piercing through grimy windows, illuminating mountains of ancient hay, rotting timbers, and the accumulated detritus of years. The air hung thick with the musty scent of decay, animal droppings, and the ghosts of lives once lived within its vast space. Alara took it all in, a surge of grim determination stiffening her spine. This was not merely work. It was a battlefield. She began immediately, driven by an urgency that defied her weariness. Armed with a shovel and a broom far too heavy for her slight frame, she attacked the hardened filth with a ferocity born of desperation. Hours blurred into a relentless cycle of scraping, sweeping, and hauling. Her muscles screamed, her hands blistered, but she ignored the pain, focusing instead on the steady progress, the small victory of each cleared patch of floor. The sheer scale of the task was daunting, yet each movement was purposeful, each breath drawn deep to fuel her labor. Sheriff Kane was a constant, unsettling presence. He appeared silently, often leaning against a doorway or watching from a distance, his storm-gray eyes observing her every move. He never offered help, never spoke a word of encouragement or criticism. His silence was a weighty thing, sometimes oppressive, sometimes strangely comforting. It allowed her to lose herself in the rhythm of the work, her thoughts free to drift to the children, hidden in the copse of trees at the edge of his property. During her short, furtive breaks, she would slip away, her heart a drumbeat of anxiety, to check on them, to share the small portion of dried meat and stale bread she had brought. Their pale faces and hungry eyes reinforced her resolve, pushing her back to the barn with renewed vigor. One afternoon, returning from a particularly grueling stretch of hauling rotten hay, Alara found a tin cup sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door. It was filled with cool, fresh water, condensation clinging to its sides. Beside it, a small, wrapped bundle, a thick, dense piece of cornbread. She looked around, but Kane was nowhere in sight. Had he left it? The thought sent a peculiar tremor through her. It was an offering, silent and anonymous, but unmistakably kind. She drank the water slowly, savoring its coolness, and ate the cornbread, the unfamiliar richness a balm to her empty stomach. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes, chipping away at the rigid facade she had built around her heart. Days turned into a grueling week. The barn slowly began to reveal its true structure beneath the layers of grime. Sunlight streamed in more freely through cleaner panes, illuminating the sturdy timbers, the empty stalls that once housed magnificent horses. Alara worked with a methodical intensity, her movements becoming more efficient, her weariness a dull throb rather than an incapacitating ache. She noticed, too, that Kane's observations grew less frequent, his visits shorter. Perhaps he was satisfied with her progress, or perhaps he was simply a man of few words, and even fewer unnecessary actions. Yet there were moments. She would glance up, catch his gaze across the vast space of the barn, and for a fleeting instant, she imagined she saw something flicker within those deep-set eyes, not judgment, but a quiet recognition. Recognition of what she couldn't say. Her own desperate strength? Or perhaps simply the sheer scale of the work she had undertaken alone. It was a fragile, unspoken truce that formed between them, built on the shared understanding of arduous labor and the vast silence that defined their interactions. She still held her breath when he was near, still feared discovery, but the raw edge of terror had dulled, replaced by wary anticipation. Her children, her secret, remained her most terrifying vulnerability, a constant knot of fear in her gut. She knew the day would come when her careful facade would inevitably crumble. The air had turned crisp, carrying the first icy breath of true autumn. Alara's work in the barn was nearing its end, the once squalid space now transformed into a clean, echoing shell. Her pay, generous by her standards, had been left in a canvas pouch on an old workbench each evening, a silent transaction. It was enough to buy proper food, warm blankets, and the promise of a future, however precarious. She had even managed to purchase a small, dented kettle to boil water for the children, a luxury that brought tears to her eyes. This particular afternoon, a sudden, fierce squall had blown in, lashing rain against the barn's newly cleaned windows. The wind howled like a banshee, threatening to rip the very roof from its rafters. Alara had hurried her last tasks, eager to get back to the children who were now hidden not in the copse of trees, but in a small, abandoned trapper's shack she'd found further out on the ranch. It was crude, but it offered better shelter from the elements. As she gathered her few tools, a faint, high-pitched whimper cut through the roar of the wind. It was Maeve. Fear, cold and sharp, seized Alara. She must have woken, perhaps calling for her in her sleep. Alara had been so careful, so meticulous in her secrecy. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening. The whimper came again, louder this time, followed by Finn's whispered shush. Kane stood in the main doorway of the barn, a dark silhouette against the gray, churning sky. He had entered silently as always. His gaze was fixed on her, unwavering. He hadn't heard, she prayed. He couldn't have. But then his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing, his gaze drifting past her, towards the direction of the old shack, towards the faint, almost imperceptible sounds. Alara's breath hitched. There was no escape, no denial. The secret she had guarded with every fiber of her being was about to be laid bare. Shame washed over her, hot and stinging, followed by a cold dread. She braced herself for the anger, the accusation, the inevitable dismissal that would follow. All her careful planning, all her arduous labor, reduced to nothing. What was that sound? Kane's voice, though low, cut through the storm. It was not accusing, not yet, but it held an undeniable edge of inquiry. Alara swallowed, her voice cracking as she tried to form an excuse. Just the wind, Sheriff. Or a wild animal. He took a step towards her, then another, his imposing figure filling the vast space. His eyes, usually unreadable, now held a glint of something she couldn't quite decipher. Suspicion? Understanding? It did not sound like wind, nor animal. It sounded like a child. Her carefully constructed world shattered. Alara stumbled backward, clutching her hands together. Sheriff, please. I can explain. Her voice was a desperate whisper. They have nowhere else to go. Their father, he's gone. Couldn't leave them. I only took the job because they were starving. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, tears finally stinging her eyes. I swear I didn't mean to deceive you. I just needed to keep them safe. Please don't turn us out. I'll leave immediately. I'll take them and go. Just don't report me. Don't send them away. Kane stopped before her, his height towering over her, casting her in shadow. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, taking in her fear, her ragged despair. The children's quiet murmuring continued, a faint background chorus to her own unraveling. He must have seen their small, pale faces reflected in her own desperation. Finally, he spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle, almost a murmur against the storm's fury. Show me. It was not an order. It was a quiet request. And in that moment, the expected anger did not come. Instead, a peculiar, unfamiliar weight began to lift from Alara's chest. The air, once thick with secrets, suddenly seemed to clear. Alara led him, not to the crude lean-to she'd first imagined for them, but to the forgotten trapper's shack. The rain had intensified, soaking her thin shawl, but she barely noticed. All she could feel was the silent, watchful presence of Kane behind her, the weight of his discovery hanging heavy in the storm-laden air. The shack, barely more than a hovel, offered scant protection. Inside, Finn and Clara huddled around Maeve, whose small whimpers had subsided into quiet sniffles. Their eyes, wide and fearful, turned to the imposing figure who filled the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the last vestiges of daylight. Kane surveyed the scene, the meager fire, the thin blankets, the children's pinched faces. His gaze lingered on Maeve, then on Clara clutching her wooden doll, and finally on Finn, whose small shoulders were squared with a defiance that mirrored his mother's. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound, silent understanding. He did not speak immediately, allowing the quiet truth of their existence to fill the small space. "They are cold," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of the harshness she had anticipated. "And they are hungry." Alara could only nod, tears blurring her vision. "Yes, Sheriff, we have managed. But it's been hard." He turned, his back to them for a moment, then faced her again. "The barn is clean, but there is more work to be done. The old stable needs repair. The ranch house, it needs tending. There are rooms that could be made ready. For you and your children." His words were direct, practical, yet they resonated with an unexpected tenderness. "It is not charity, Mrs. Vance. It is a proposition. You are a hard worker. You have proven that. I require assistance. My housekeeper passed last year. The ranch needs a woman's touch, a family's presence." Alara stared at him, unable to speak. The offer was so vast, so unexpected. It felt like a dream. Not dismissal, but an invitation. Not condemnation, but salvation. Her throat tightened with emotion she could not articulate. I don't understand, Sheriff," she whispered. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, yet strangely reassuring. "I understand hardship, Mrs. Vance, and I recognize resilience. You have both in spades. This land can be unforgiving, but it can also provide. I am offering you a chance to build something here, a home, a life, in exchange for your work, your diligence, and the quiet dignity you possess." He did not mention her lie, her deception. He saw past it, to the desperate mother beneath. He saw her strength, not her vulnerability. This man, an enigma of solitude and wealth, understood that true value lay not in possessions, but in character. Over the following weeks, Alara and her children moved into a small, sun-drenched cottage on Kane's sprawling property. The transformation was profound. The children, once pallid and silent, began to blossom, their laughter echoing through the small rooms, their cheeks regaining a healthy flush. Alara, too, changed. The constant fear that had shadowed her every step began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose and a growing confidence. She worked tirelessly, tending to the ranch house, her hands no longer blistered, but strong and capable. Kane remained a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He ensured they were well-fed, well-clothed, and safe. He would sometimes appear at the cottage door, a bag of freshly caught fish, or a handful of new books for Finn. Their relationship was not one of employer and employee, but of two solitary souls who had found an unspoken understanding, a quiet partnership born of shared humanity and a mutual respect for the unyielding demands of the land. Alara had found not just a job, but a sanctuary. Her children had found a home. And in the stoic, unexpected kindness of Sheriff Kane, Alara discovered that resilience was not merely about enduring the storm, but about finding the courage to rebuild, brick by painstaking brick, in its aftermath. The silent man who had once been a symbol of her desperate fear now stood as a quiet testament to her unwavering strength, a strength he had recognized and nurtured, allowing a forgotten dignity to finally bloom.